So I've been putting this video off for a couple of weeks now at least, and I've had it in mind since I did the first Peterson paradox video. And this was supposed to be part of the third installment of that video series about the Peterson paradox. And if you just don't know what I'm talking about, just go back and look at that video if you care to. It's about 30 minutes long, and you'll kind of get an idea of what I'm talking about there. But I've sort of been letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, and I think, like Jordan Peterson says, just try to do something, and it doesn't have to be perfect at first, right? You can do it badly at first, and just keep on doing it, and eventually, you'll get to where you want to be if you keep at it. And so this is not going to be the perfect video I wanted it to be, but it's going to be a video, and at least it will be out there, instead of just being in my mind doing no good there. So I thought this was a really interesting debate on the Unbelievable channel, and I hope I can play just bits and pieces of it and comment on it enough so that I don't get a copyright infringement strike. I've been appealing all the strikes I've gotten, and so far so good. I've won them all except for that one music video that I tried to comment on, and it was like an automatic blocking. I couldn't even appeal it. So anyway, so it's Michael Ruse versus John Lennox, Science, Faith, and the Evidence for God. And what I think is interesting about this video, and the reason why I wanted to bring it up in the paradox, my Jordan Peterson paradox series, is that the positions these men take are very interesting, and they are sort of reversed from what you might think. And I'm going to try to explain that now. So here you have on screen is Michael Ruse, and he's going to take the atheistic position on the stage, as the Unbelievable channel usually has someone who's sort of atheistic, and then someone who is a Christian talk about their beliefs. And John Lennox, I'm going to show him, of course, after Michael Ruse. You might be familiar with him. He's done quite a few videos on YouTube that I've seen. I've never seen Michael Ruse before, so it's really interesting to get to know someone new. And I think he has a very interesting perspective. And so John Lennox is a mathematician at Oxford, and I believe Michael Ruse is a philosopher at Oxford. So they both have, high pedigree, genius minds. And what's interesting about John Lennox in this debate is that he takes the position of what I would call like a scientific materialist position, in that he values the things that are coming from the material world, like our brains and our rationality and arguments and philosophy and various things like that. The historicity of the Bible, I think, comes up. And that might not be too shocking, because what has become popular in modern apologetics is this looking for evidence, because that's what we're trained to do with our modern minds, is look for concrete material evidence for our positions. And if we don't have a concrete piece of evidence, then we have to back it up with rationality. And this is Sam Harris's God. Rationality is not the end-all be-all that we should be looking to support all of our arguments. And to even make an argument itself is bending to the presupposition of that Sam Harris God. So you might be wondering, so what the heck are you supposed to do if you're not making arguments and you're not looking for material evidence? Then you're just being duped, and you're being tricked, you're being fooled, you're naive, and so forth. But you're going to see something that Michael Ruse does, and again, I'm sort of having them swap roles, and it's interesting to think of it this way. Imagine if he's taking the Christian position. Now, he's going to take somewhat of an agnostic position. I'm going to let him explain some of this. He has an interesting background. I believe he said his parents were Quakers, and so right away there's something unique about his belief structure and how he grew up. So I'm going to let him speak a little bit, and then I'm going to get back to this idea of the two positions being swapped in argumentation, and what are you supposed to do if you're not presenting arguments and you're not looking for material evidence and so forth.
Objector. And during the war, they came in contact with the Quakers. And after the war, my father and my mother joined the Quakers. And so I grew up very intensely as a Quaker, to the extent that I was sent away to a Quaker boarding school when I was a teenager. I'm still not quite sure, but about the age of 20, 21, my faith started to fade. As I say, it wasn't a St. Paul or Saul on the road to Damascus experience in reverse. It was just, as I like to say, like collecting stamps and loving baked beans. One day I did these things and loved these things, and the next day they'd more or less gone. And I really thought, back then at 2021, well, I'm sure if I get to 70, I'll be getting back on side with the big chap in the sky. But it just wasn't that sort of way. However, that said, my non-existent God, who's a Calvinist, and so guides everything that we do, made sure that I was going to work on Charles Darwin, which meant that I was brought into contact with the science-religion relationship. And so this has been something which has been both a personal interest and a professional interest, because my daytime job is a professor of philosophy. And so this has been a constant, what shall I say, topic of great interest to me. I've spent a lot of time fighting creationists in the 40s, but I've also come in more and more in contact with people like John, who are genuinely trying to bridge the gap between science and religion. As I say, I'm 78 now, and I don't have any more faith. I'm an atheist about Christianity, but I'm fairly agnostic about whether any of it means anything, and I'm sure this will come out more in the discussion. So I always like to say, once a Quaker, always a Quaker. And I've certainly grown up with an intense sense that the only truly happy person is the person who's serving others. And I've been very, very lucky. I've been a professor all my life. It's a wonderful job that way. But also, the Quakerism I grew up with was very mystical in a way, that God really wasn't somebody like me in a bedsheet, and much more unknown and unknowable. As I say, I no longer believe in a force for good or a force for ill, at least in that sort of way. But certainly my religion then and now has always been one which, is it Christian, is it agnostic? There are days when I'm not quite sure. No, it's pretty much always agnostic, but it's on a continuum. It's not like Richard Dawkins, where you go along and then suddenly you fall off the cliff.
Now, I want this to sort of be an introductory video to this this larger video that I want to do. And so I'm going to just lay out some of my ideas here after you heard him speak. And because I played so much of that video for you to hear him speak, I kind of have to give you kind of a equal amount of commentary if I'm going to make a fair use of this video. And so one of the impressions I got from this opening statement is I liked his honesty. And it's something you don't often hear from the pop atheists. Not that they're not honest, but it's the way he described his atheism and Christianity and agnosticism all on a continuum, on a kind of spectrum. And you don't often hear that. And he made the comparison with Dawkins, where you fall off a cliff all of a sudden. And with him, he acknowledges it's more of a continuum. And I think that's a very honest thing to say. And I think it's a much more interesting place to have a discussion, acknowledging that and talking about that. And it's a much more productive discussion if you're just honest about that. And maybe these other guys, these other pop atheists, don't even realize that their belief systems is sort of on a continuum. Now, the other thing that may strike you as odd, since I said maybe you could think about them as switching roles, as this man Ruse taking the Christian position and Lennox taking the materialist position. You might say, well, how could that be? Because he just said he doesn't really believe there's a force for good or evil. And you're right. I don't mean everything he says is exactly as I would put it in a Christian position or perspective. And he says, oh, the big man in the sky and the old man in the sky with a beard and wrapped in a sheet. Like these are cartoonized 13-year-old impressions of God. And then he brings in this old Quaker notion of God as the entirely other. And you're going to hear that in my Karl Barth series, bit by bit, about how God is wholly other. Now, what I want to do with this video series is explain part of the Peterson paradox. And again, I've kind of skipped ahead to the third section of that video series. I've skipped the entire second video installment so far because, like I tried to explain a minute ago, I've been letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, and I just want to get this out here, and then I will put together that second installment that will hopefully shed a lot more light on this third installment. But I think you can still put together the pieces I'm trying to put together here. So to answer the question I opened with, well, what are you going to do if you're not going to construct an argument? Because that uses the Sam Harris God of rationalism and rationality, and you're not going to look for material evidence because that's the materialistic view of the world. And what's also interesting about those two things is you're going to see, well, C.S. Lewis was great at making arguments, and he was great at putting them forth. He was great at rhetoric. Rhetoric is another way that you actually don't use arguments. You're using speech. You're using what would you say? There's a word for it from the New Testament, kerygma or something. It's something about like a sermon. It's like a sermon, and that's another way of putting forth not an argument, but it's putting forth a way of thinking. A way of feeling and thinking. See, this is the thing. It's that your thinking and your feeling has to be clasped together. They have to be united. And there's a reason why you feel something, and there's a reason why you also think something. And your feelings and thinking should be aligned. And to emphasize rationality and your thinking over and above to the exclusion of your feeling is sort of where we're at in our modern day. This is emphasizing the conscious mind over the unconscious. And this is sort of what Jung warned us about, that if we keep going this way, we're going to be sort of these unconscious monsters. And as Peterson says, we're not going to be facing our shadows. We're not going to be admitting that we could have been the guards at Auschwitz. And so one of the things I want to emphasize is something that N.T. Wright brought up, I noticed in one of Vanderklay's recent videos, and it's about love. And what people aren't often realizing, if you're not going to put forth an argument and you're not going to look for material evidence, well, what is it going to be? Well, what Christians have is a love relationship with God. And this is something that I think almost comes up in McGilchrist in The Master and His Emissary, but not quite. And I think you'll hear N.T. Wright talk more about this. It's the love part of it that's missing. And when people meet and they fall in love and they establish a relationship, this is, on any level. There's so many levels of love relationship that we have in our as human beings. But the one special one and one very particular and peculiar one we have is a God to human love relationship and a human to God. And it comes from God first, and then and we should respond in kind. And I'm going to get into that with my Barth series as well. But so what else? What does this mean? Like, so how can you present a love relationship to people instead of looking for historicity or looking for the right kind of argument? And yeah, this is part of the difficulty that modern Christians are in, because let's say their big hitting weapon, or the thing that they should be using, the most powerful tool that they have at their disposal is their love relationship with God. and they're not using it because they're being sort of brainwashed into saying you have to look for the historical evidence, you have to look for the material evidence, you have to look for the arguments, the right reasons, and so forth. And if you don't, well, you're just discounted. You're not going to be there. One of the things Jordan Peterson brought up recently, I'm trying to remember where it was. He said, it might have been in a Sam Harris debate. He said, I'm going to paint a picture for you. I'm going to paint a picture. So that's another way of looking at it. He's not constructing something. I know Vanderklay said, he's building blocks. He's building them up as the constructor, and that's a very Christian way of looking at it. It's a very C.S. Lewis way of looking at it, where God is the creator. He's building the universe up. He's the builder, and I agree that that's part of it. But what Jordan said there, he's painting a picture, and that's sort of the right hemisphere way of looking at it. And I think ultimately, when you have the love relationship idea, what you're going to be doing is material evidence and rationality is going to be part of the picture. It's not the whole picture, okay? So it's, as McGilchrist always points out, we have two hemispheres for a reason. It's to deal with these different aspects of reality. And, one hemisphere is very specialized at going after what's concrete, what we might call real, what's mathematical and so forth. And the other hemisphere is sort of about what's unknown territory, what's more about betweenness. McGilchrist brings up this idea of betweenness, the idea of relating to other people and how that's like relating to music and so forth. Knowing a person is not reading a bunch of stats about the person, their height, weight, where they're from, and where they live and where they work and so forth. What do they do? You'll notice some of the first things people ask someone is sort of right off of a police blotter. So what's your name? Or where are you from? What do you do? Right? What do you do for work? These things tell you nothing about virtually nothing about the person. They can give you some idea. I will grant you that. But they don't give you what it's really like to actually know the person. So when you start to form a relationship with the person, and you spend some time with them and you converse with them and you're in their presence, there's a whole lot of stuff you're going to learn about them that you're not going to find on a sheet of paper of statistics. And so that's more about the right hemisphere. That's the relating to other people. And that has been it's being extracted from us in our society. And if you go into my Mo Meaning Mondays series, it's right in the beginning of Maps of Meaning. It's how meaning is being extracted from our lives and from our minds by our modern scientific worldview. It wasn't like that back in the medieval days. Meaning and purpose and everything was sort of all put together, including sense data about objects, and now everything is extrapolated. I know that might sound weird if you're not familiar with Maps of Meaning or my Mo Meaning Mondays video series. Just go check it out and it'll make a lot more sense. So what I want to argue for in this video that I'm going to make, and this is an introduction to that, is what Christians should do is something along the lines of what you're going to see in this debate. And I'm adding in the element of the love relationship aspect. But what you're going to see Michael Ruse do is he's going to start emphasizing the metaphorical and the symbolic in the Bible. And you're going to see John Lennox emphasizing the historical and the material. Okay? Again, that's one part of it. But it's not the whole picture. I think the picture is actually completed by his opponent, Michael Ruse, who brings up the symbolism and the metaphorical, and you might say the allegorical and the parable and all of that kind of stuff. So when you look in the Bible and you're trying to form a love relationship, or you're going to form a relationship with Jesus Christ or with God, right? The historical facts are part of that. It's a one layer, okay? And it's not the most important layer. It might be the least important layer. And what's most important to forming the relationship to this being who instantiated himself in the person of Jesus Christ as a human being, so that I think we can relate to him. Part of it is understanding. You're going to get more about that person, about that being, from the images, from the symbolism, from the metaphors. And in fact, you can probably only understand that being and that person from the metaphors and from the parables and from all of that other stuff. It's not going to be from Jesus's height and weight, from where he was exactly born to where he died. Though those places, notice, it's not about the geography, it's about the symbolism of the geography when you start to really get into it. So yes, the historicity plays one role. It's sort of your right hand. It's the grasping of the left hemisphere on something that is here, and it's something that's material and fact. But you need the other hand. You need the left hemisphere also. The right hemisphere to sort of reach out and establish that love relationship with God. And while you're doing that, and part of this debate here, to do that with the people listening, to do that with the audience, to do that with whomever you're around, you want to always try to establish that good relationship with them as well. So again, I'm going to be playing clips of this video in this next longer video that I'm going to be doing, where I comment on exactly what Michael Ruse is doing here and how that complements what Lennox is doing and how it makes a complete picture for what the modern Christian ought to be doing when they go to have such discussions. And I know it's a little bit different from what you're used to hearing, and it's a little bit different from what you might hear on Vanderklay's channel. But I hope that's why you come to my channels, to hear just a slightly different perspective and not just the same thing that you already know, right? So again, thanks for listening, and please hit the subscribe button if you haven't already.
Well, there's a guy who's got a little YouTube channel, and I've been sending a lot of people his way, Node in a Network, and he's basically been reading all of the stuff in the footnotes of Maps of Meaning,
where we're all sort of plugged in as like nodes on the network.
Node in a network, there's a good username.
A node in a network.
The wrong model, because you're at the center of a network. You're a node in a network.